it so I don't mess it up.
Is it a Hebrew term? I don't even know.
So,
Psalms.
let me see if where I might have defined this. We did. It was. I'm gonna try and go off of my memory. I think the Greek word was like psalmo, and it was basically songs, sacred songs. Okay, the Hebrew title of the book means songs of praise. The Greek title, psalmoi, has come to mean sacred songs sung to musical accompaniment. So that was kind of what the name Psalms mean. Okay. So, what were the Psalms written for? And one of the big things that we talked about was that because they're Psalms, they're prayers, they're songs, they're these expressions from these writers, I felt like it was important that we try and experience them in a way that's different than typically as we go through different books of the Bible and learn things. Because I think the Psalms, they were written during different events, they were written in different circumstances, and it's really helpful to get into what those circumstances were to understand a little bit more about the psalm. And they're really meant to be, I think, experienced. So we listened to a few psalms that were put to music the last week. We'll do the same thing this week. But this week what we're going to do is, we talked about kind of why they were written. We focused on that there were some psalms of lament, some songs of praise, prayer, and we listened to a couple of those, and you could feel and see and understand the different emotions in those psalms and how some were meant to be jubilant and some were meant to be very somber. And so the idea of experiencing the Psalms, when you look at the whole trajectory of Psalms, it really moves from sort of a despair to hope. And we looked at that overview of the Psalms. They tell, really, in a sense, the story of God's promise, from the Garden of Eden all the way to the promised Messiah. They are a place we can go to when we need help finding words to express our deepest emotions to God. The poet's angry, intense honesty presents an invitation to come without pretense or polish and offer our most genuine selves to the Father, asking for His justice. So I thought that was very interesting, that sort of quote that I grabbed. The idea that the different writers of the Psalms, they really had these different emotions that they came to the Father with. There wasn't any like, well, you know what, let me cool down first. It was just raw emotion. You know what, let me wipe the tears, let me kind of get through it first. It was, and we'll see that today a little bit, it was raw emotion. And I think God wants us to bring that to Him so He can help us work through those emotions. Through joy and sorrow, injustice and evil, the Psalms provide a roadmap for how to pray and seek God in the midst of life. In reading them, we see that anger and sorrow are regularly combined with praise and hope. So interesting that the Psalms provide a roadmap for how to pray and seek God in the midst of life, in the midst of what goes on every day, the things that happen to us. That's where these Psalms come from. Things were happening in their lives, and they wrote about it. They put it down on paper. They expressed it. And it was helpful for them to get through things. And again, giving them over to God to help God work through them with them. These aren't just abstract responses or lame attempts to feel better. In the midst of terrible suffering, these poets still acknowledge that God is majestic and worthy of honor. They knew He hadn't promised them a pain-free existence, and that much of their suffering came about as a result of their own rebellion or disobedience. They looked to prophecies and promises in the Torah for encouragement and hope for their future. So, we did an overview of the Psalms. We talked about this sort of reason they were written, this sort of expression of their emotion, their relationship with their God, with their Father. But now I want to look at how is it that we should read the Psalms, right? How does it work for us? And I think that's very important because what we're going to look at here, it really does a very good job of sort of showing how relatable the Psalms are. We mentioned that in the first class, that the Psalms are the most popular book of the Bible, the most quoted in the New Testament. Psalm 23 is probably the most well-known Bible passage. And you'll see, I think, why when we look at this. So this is, again, another video from the Bible Project. I think that this is very helpful. So let's listen. Hey, Todd, you can hear me, right? You want to turn out that light? Thanks.
We've been talking about poetry in the Bible, how biblical poets love design and masterfully use metaphor and symbolism. To ponder ideas slowly and from many angles.
And the largest collection of poetry in the Bible is the book of Psalms. So that's what we're going to look at here.
Now, the Israelites composed lots of poetry throughout their history.
Yeah, poems were written by Israelite sages, kings, and prophets. Some poems were sung by choirs in the Jerusalem temple, while others were prayed by families at home. And over the centuries, the most important and widely read poems were compiled together to be read or sung on special occasions.
And I'm familiar with books of poetry, a large collection of the greatest poems in one place, and I can read through and pick my favorites.
But the Book of Psalms isn't that kind of collection. Here, each poem has been expertly crafted and then placed where it is for a reason, to create a storyline from the book's beginning to its end. The Psalms poetically retell the entire biblical story, and they invite you into a literary temple.
A literary temple?
Yeah, so the tabernacle, and then later the temple in Jerusalem, were where ancient Israelites went to meet with God. When you arrived, you would see art and imagery everywhere. You'd see priests performing rituals, you'd hear songs and prayers, all of it symbolically proclaiming that your God rules the world from this mountain and you're in his living room.
So the temple was a place to be in God's presence and also to immerse yourself in the story of God's kingdom.
Exactly. And so try to imagine how traumatic it was when the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem, plundered and burned the temple, and then took many Israelites into exile.
Yeah, where can they go now to meet with God, to sing their story and say their prayers?
That's where the Book of Psalms comes in. It's a prayer book for exiles, designed as a virtual temple. You enter the Psalms to meet with God and to hear the entire biblical story of God's kingdom sung back to you in poetry.
Cool, but how does the Psalms do it?
Let's start with the book's design. There are 150 poems broken up into 5 clear sections. At the beginning, there's been placed a short introduction, Psalms 1 and 2, which lay out the main themes of the whole book by reviewing the biblical storyline.
Okay.
Psalm 1 looks back to the Garden of Eden and its river of life.
Yeah, God placed humanity in a garden temple. And here, humans decide to define good and evil on their own terms, and so are exiled from the garden.
But the first psalm paints a portrait of hope, about an upright human who delights in God's wisdom, which is called Torah, or instruction. This person is like the tree of life in the garden temple. They eternally blossom because they're planted in the river of God's life.
Yeah, that's beautiful, but who's it supposed to be?
Well, remember that story in Genesis? After humanity's foolish rebellion, God made a promise.
Oh, right, a future human, the seed of the woman who would come and defeat evil and restore the world.
And that's what Psalm 2 is about. God's promise that a king would come from the line of David. He's called the Son of God and the Messiah. God appoints him to bring justice on human evil and to restore God's kingdom and peace over the nations.
So Psalms 1 and 2 introduce all these main themes.
Yes, and then the book develops those themes through the 5 sections. The first 2 explore the complicated story of David and his royal family. The third section focuses on the tragedy of Israel's exile and the downfall of David's royal line. But then the 4th and 5th sections rekindle the hope for the Messiah, a new temple, and God's kingdom on the other side of the exile. Then the book ends with a 5-part conclusion, praising God for his faithfulness.
Cool. Now, nearly half of the Psalms are connected to one guy, King David, who God chose to rule Israel.
Yes, David's story is really important in this book. He experienced many times of hardship, but he trusted God with radical faith. And in these poems, David shares his fears, confesses his failures, and offers thanks to his Redeemer. And he's constantly speaking of a deep longing to be in God's presence in the temple.
But wait, David lived before the temple was even built.
Exactly. This portrait of David, hoping and praying for God's kingdom and a future temple, it resembles the hopes of the later generations of the exiles. And so, David's prayers could become theirs as well.
David's like a prayer coach, giving us words for how to pray and how to discover God's presence in good times and bad.
Exactly. There are 73 poems connected to David, but most of the rest come from later generations of biblical poets, and they have learned to pray and hope like David. And so the end result is the Book of Psalms, designed as a virtual temple for all generations of God's people.
This isn't a kind of book you just read once and put down.
No, it's designed for a lifetime of slow rereading and reflection. These prayers and laments and songs of praise are meant to become our own. They're poems for exiles who are learning to live by God's wisdom and to seek God's justice in the world as they hope for the coming Messiah and the kingdom of God.
It's really interesting, right? That the Psalms and reading of the Psalms, we should be putting ourselves right into it, right? Don't we long for God's presence? Isn't that what we hope for? Right? And it forms a foundation of everything that we know and do and how we interact with each other, right? Aren't we exiles? Strangers in a strange land, right? So how do we conduct ourselves in exile? What do we look for? How do we read this? So very interesting that the Psalms really become something that, as the video kind of mentioned, we were given guidance on how to approach God, how to share with God the way we're feeling in exile, the way we're feeling when we're longing for His presence, right? And sometimes, those feelings, are strong for something at a particular time. You really feel like, please come today, right? Or sometimes it's like you're frustrated with the injustice in the world, right? You're frustrated with the way that the governments are doing things, or you're frustrated with the sort of evil and the death and destruction of things that happen, right? The diseases that affect people. And so you express those things. And, breaking it down sort of into these experiences, it's interesting that a lot of this is David's personal experience, right? We read his emotions and his thoughts. Then a lot of it is the nation of Israel's experience, right? When they are carried away into captivity. We see some of that. And then there's a lot of the hope of experiencing the coming Messiah, the temple and restoration of God's kingdom, that wanting to experience that, right? So the Psalms are meant to be read by us, God's people, as an experience of personal emotions and thoughts, a figurative exile with the hope of experiencing a glorious future age with the return of Jesus and the establishment of God's kingdom. And like I just mentioned, these were sort of breaking the Psalms down into sort of these experiences. And I've selected a couple to just share with you. And then what I'd like to do is maybe kick it off quickly with a personal psalm or two of meaning, right, for some reason, and then open it up to the class to see if anyone has an experience, anyone has a favorite psalm, something that they've turned to time and time again to help them through difficulties, or that they've turned to praise God for the goodness that He's shown us. So the first that I want to look at is Psalm 37. So if you want to turn to Psalm 37. It's really, we'll spend a couple of minutes here. It's a magnificent psalm. And I think, again, the way it's meant to be experienced, we will do before we dive in. So just listen up. This is a sort of summary of Psalm 37.
Don't fret because of evil men, or envy those who sin. For like the grass they'll wither soon, like plants they'll die away. They soon will die away. Trust in God, do good and dwell in safety in the land. Delight yourself in God alone, and He will give to you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust Him and He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, and the justice of your cause Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Don't fret when men succeed in their ways as they work their wicked schemes. As they work their wicked schemes. Better the little righteous have than the wealth of wicked men. For God will break their power down, but the righteous He upholds. The righteous He upholds. When I was young, now I'm old, yet I have never seen a righteous man forsaken, or his children begging bread. His children begging bread.
So here David's sharing something very personal, right? That he's grappled with for a long time. His whole life, he has grappled with this idea of, why do the wicked prosper? Why is it that I look around and I see that people who don't serve God have plenty, are prospering, and affliction falls on the righteous? I try and follow you, God. I try and do what you want me to do, yet I have Saul chasing around to kill me. Why is it that I got to dwell in caves? And then this guy over here gets a nice palace. He's a real, crummy guy, right? So David shares his thoughts in this chapter later in his life, after he's had lots of experience, when he's had some time to consider and ponder this question. And he starts off and he tells us, don't constantly be worried or anxious in considering the wicked. Don't fret about it. You waste your time thinking about it. The writer is reminding his audience that they should not worry when they see the apparent success of the wicked. And it's fitting that the word fret can also refer to the corrosion or wearing away of something. The author is clearly stating that allowing ourselves to worry over the success of the wicked can cause corrosion in our lives. It may not make sense why the wicked are prospering, so he gives us advice and shares us his wisdom. Look, it may not make sense. You may not get it. You may not be able to understand. But don't worry about it. Trust in the Lord and do good. That's what you need to consider. That's what you need to worry about. That's what you need to have on your mind. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. So David gives us this problem in the first verse, right? Oh, why do the wicked prosper? But then he goes on and says to trust in the Lord, to delight yourself in the Lord. He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him. He will act. I'm an old man now. I've experienced this. I've seen it. I've gone through it. His advice, sometimes you need to be still before the Lord and patiently wait for Him. And again, don't worry about the one who prospers his way over the man who carries out evil devices. Don't spend your time thinking about these people. Rest before the Lord. Stand still. Stop trying to figure it out on your own. Stop taking matters into your own hands. Instead, patiently wait for God to work in His due time. Such great advice from an elder to younger believers. And it's hard, but experience and wisdom taught David this, that sometimes you just need to be still, and you don't have to act. You don't have to figure it out. David reminds us, as you continue to work through this chapter, that the way of the wicked will perish. Salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. In verses 27, he says, "Turn away from evil and do good, so shall you dwell forever. For the Lord loves justice. He won't forsake His saints. He didn't forsake me. They are preserved forever. But the children of the wicked, they shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell upon it forever." David was sure of the promises that God had given. And he reminds us of those. So when lamenting over the injustice we see in this world, this is a perfect psalm to use for prayer and meditation and praise. It's a response to the problem of evil, which the Old Testament often expresses as a question. Why do the wicked prosper and the good suffer? The psalm answers that the situation is only temporary. God will reverse things, rewarding the good and punishing the wicked here on earth. That's the whole point of God's kingdom. Wickedness will be taken away. Evil will be taken away. His light, His goodness will shine and cover the earth. So let's scooch over to Psalm 137. So we've dove into one of David's very personal psalms about his thoughts and his feelings, his advice and his wisdom when it comes to the wicked prospering. And it's something, again, that is helpful for us. We can experience that. We can, I feel like it was just recent that somebody was talking about the inequalities in the world, the injustices, all these things that they see, and it was upsetting them. Go to Psalm 37, right? That's the whole point of why they were written. So in Psalm 137, it's a bit of a difficult psalm, so we'll tackle this a little bit, but this is all about the exile. So let's experience this psalm, and then we'll dive into it a little bit. Oh. Okay. Trying not to have that awkward buzzing the whole time, so I'm taking it in and out. Don't know why it does that, but it does.
By the rivers there we sat, in Babylon we sat and we wept, and upon the willow trees hung our harps. When we remembered Zion, by our captors we were told, sing a song, the song of Zion. But Babylon we will not sing, the song of the Lord. For we remember Zion. We remember Zion. Whoa! song of the Lord while we are in a foreign land. Tell me, how can we sing the song of the Lord while we are in a foreign land? If I forget you, oh Jerusalem, may my right hand lose its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. Remember, Lord, what Edom did. Remember, oh Lord, on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to its foundations. Oh, daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who will repay you. Oh, daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who will repay you for all of the things you have done. Blessed is he, blessed is he who destroys your progeny. By the rivers there we wept, by the rivers there we wept, when we remembered Zion. Your progeny. By the rivers there we wept, by the rivers there we wept, when we remembered Zion. By the rivers there we wept, by the rivers there we wept, by the rivers there we sat and wept.
Can you appreciate the emotion that is running through Jeremiah's pen as he writes that? I don't think I did really before diving into this psalm a little bit more deeply. Here he is expressing the sadness that he and his nation is feeling, his fellow brothers and sisters, the families. You know, the city of their God that represented all for them. It was everything. The temple, the city, their worship, their relationship with God was destroyed in front of their eyes, and they were carried away into captivity. Everything that they had known was gone. This is raw emotion right here. This is raw emotion. How can we even lift up our voices to our God in this land, in this Babylon? And he's describing that his captors were sort of like prodding them, making fun of them. Come on, go ahead, sing. You guys were all about singing, right? You guys were all about praise to your God. Where's that now? Look at verse 5 and verse 6. The attachment to their city. If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. I don't ever want to play an instrument again. If I forget Jerusalem, my hands might as well be withered up. I'll never be able to play a harp again. If I don't remember you, let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth so I can't even utter praises anymore. This is how he's feeling. Now, it's not a question of right or wrong, because we'll talk about that in a second maybe, but it's just a question of raw emotion. He is just laying it before God, how he feels. And he's saying to God, God, remember against the Edomites and what they said when the city was being destroyed. Lay it bare. Remember them. Babylon, doomed to destruction. Jeremiah, I know the prophecies. God gave them to me in Jeremiah 50 and 51, in Isaiah 13. I know what's going to happen to Babylon. There's going to be another kingdom to rise up and wipe it off the face of the earth, so that Babylon will never exist again. And he is saying in verses 8 and 9, please bring that day. This evil, wicked people. So Psalm 137 is a song, a psalm of lament by Jeremiah over the destruction of Jerusalem, the captivity and exile of the children of Israel. The first few verses graphically express this sorrow felt over the destruction. Again, the temple, this city, was critical to their identity, their relationship with God. And seeing it destroyed, it's almost like they became lost without it. They were determined, Jeremiah was determined, though, not to forget God. He would give everything up, not to forget. And I want to read this quote for you. Zion, as the dwelling place of God, was understood by Israel as the symbol of God's presence in their midst. Therefore, they believed, because of this, that Zion would never fall and they would always experience prosperity, safety, and security. Even if other nations should attack them, they would prevail and Yahweh would repel all attacks against them. The prophets especially gave this tradition an important place within Israel's theology as a symbol of safety and security to be found in Yahweh. Thus, Zion was a symbol of refuge and protection and a source of joy. However, in Psalm 137, Zion is no longer representing refuge and safety or joy and gladness. Zion has become a source of sorrow. The people remember Zion not with gladness but with sadness. Because Zion took such a central position in Israel's theology, the fall of Jerusalem and their consequent separation from Zion was an extremely traumatic experience for them. Remembering Zion created grief and a deep inner longing because the joy of the presence of Yahweh in the temple and their meeting with him there now existed only as a memory in their hearts. Zion was destroyed. The security offered by Zion had been shattered. The Zion tradition is turned upside down, thus bringing the experience of bitterness and sorrow so much more into focus. The presence of God, to some of them, was gone with the destruction of Zion. That represented God in the midst of them. You imagine the feelings that they had been going through. Is God no longer with us? Has God forsaken us? I thought we were his people. Thinking back on those sort of the good days of Zion, think about what is being written here. It's just raw emotion, right or wrong. So here's an interesting thing that I actually had never heard of before, right? This psalm is also considered one of the, I'm going to say this name right here, imprecatory psalms. Anybody ever hear that word? Imprecatory. That was a first for me. Okay, imprecatory psalms are those that evoke judgment, calamity, or curses upon one's enemies, or those perceived as the enemies of God. And we see this towards the end of this psalm, right? We see this in 7, 8, and 9. And it actually represents, and in some ways, especially when talking to people, it represents a difficulty that we have to overcome when people read this. This is the inspired word of God? We're going to dash little ones into pieces? It doesn't jive, right? But let's talk about it for a little bit. Although these prayers sound harsh to our safe American ears, remember that Israel faced many battles and persecutions and pressures from enemy nations. These prayers call out for God to protect them. Notice that the judgment and the destruction is left in the Lord's hands. The authors understand that it is the Lord who brings about judgment, and it's not for us to take into our own hands. And this is in line with Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies instead of hating your enemies in Matthew. So we see that upon closer inspection, and this is one of many, we're not going to go into all these imprecatory psalms, but they don't promote an attitude of hatred, but really an attitude of desiring God's justice. Again, like we said, Jeremiah was very familiar with the prophecies that God had given them concerning Babylon. And so I think while on a personal level, we can take this to us, we should always be looking for the salvation of others. But we do long for wickedness and evil and sin to be destroyed, right? And this is exactly through the lens in which Jeremiah is writing this. I know this is going to come to an end, that this wickedness is going to end. Hey, may every Babylonian convert and worship our God? Absolutely. But on a whole, judgment was coming towards this nation. What a good little graphic, right? People are brilliant out there with what they come up with, right? Praying for somebody to be struck by lightning. And that's clearly not what we see in these Psalms. You don't ever see sort of this towards individuals, right? It's usually groups of people, wickedness, this kind of concept, right? Let me just fire up this, because I felt like this was really well done in terms of understanding this concept of imprecatory psalms.
It seems to me there's a lot of confusion on this, in part because Jesus has told us to love our enemies, to pray for them, and what we're being reminded there is we are not to call down imprecations on people for personal reasons, out of individual spite. We need to be careful about that. We need to be very, very conscious of trying that part of